Ladies and gentlemen, this is TVP World. I'm your host, Benjamin Lee, and all welcome aboard the Eastern Express. This time around, we're setting our sights on a region you probably didn't realize was about to be the next big thing on the geopolitical catwalk, Central Asia. That massive landmass many of us mistake for a bunch of stands that only appear in crossword puzzles has been turning heads, especially in 2024. Russia and China are elbowing each other out of the way to woo the region, while the Europeans keep popping up with big talks about global gateway and safeguarding democracy, and somewhere in the background, the United States is storming in like, hello, we're back with a new plan and it has a snazzy name. So, without further ado, let's see what the Central Asian region has been up to in 2024.
The Central Asian region found itself in a very interesting spot in 2024. Many of its countries have had to balance ties between Russia, China and the West in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. This has been especially the case for Kazakhstan, which has tried to shake hands of all three of these sides. Astana has tried not to jeopardize its relationship with Moscow, on which it is heavily reliant, while simultaneously diversifying its trade with deals with Beijing and Washington.
We are interested in widening our economic and business cooperation. We have a particular interest in green energy, rare earth materials, climate, water, innovation and artificial intelligence.
In Uzbekistan, on the other hand, a consolidation of the Mirziyoyev regime has taken place. The country's controversial parliamentary elections were heavily criticized, as although voters had a choice between 5 registered parties, all 5 of them supported government policies. This means that voters weren't really presented with genuine alternatives, and the country is still struggling to have a dynamic and competitive political ecosystem. But there have also been some very positive developments for the region. After decades of minor clashes and tensions, Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan have been able to strike a landmark border deal. Although its finer details still have to be ironed out and each section of the border has to be decided on, it is a massive step forward in regard to resolving Central Asia's last disputed border.
And now let's take a look at the issue in greater detail. Now, just to be clear, Central Asia is done being the region you only hear about when a map fanatic tries to show off. These states are taking control of their narrative, no longer mere pawns in great power bingo. They're pivoting from the era of yes sir to we'd like to see your business proposal first, thank you very much. As 2025 approaches, the stakes keep rising. Leaders across Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan are actively courting foreign investment, championing critical minerals, and demanding more sustainable partnerships. Let's start with the dynamic duel of global rivalry, Russia and China. In 2024, Vladimir Putin made a grand tour of Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan. Kind of like a retro rock band returning for a nostalgia concert, but only in countries that he would not arrest him on the spot. He was all smiles, all talk about strong ties, and definitely throwing in a few winks that read, by the way, if you could help with those sanctions issues, that'd be great. Meanwhile, Xi Jinping was out in Kazakhstan and Tajikistan, urging everyone to hold hands and project the so-called Shanghai spirit. Picture a cosmic standoff, Xi waving the banner of the Belt and Road Initiative, Putin hinting at his Eurasian Economic Union, both sporting awkward forced grins. Central Asia is going, cool story, but we're actually busy forging our own route. Did you hear about the Middle Corridor, or did we not mention we're key in the critical mineral supply chain? But hey, it's not just about Russia and China. Across the world, leaders have suddenly realized that the region labeled Central Asia on the map is bursting with potential. The European Union is still a bit hazy on the difference between scheduling summits and actually following up on them, is ramping up interest again. It's got the Global Gateway Plan, cool branding, and is hosting periodic connectivity meetings that declare we want to reduce your dependence on China. Meanwhile, the US is humming the same tune. Critical minerals, critical minerals, critical minerals. The UK, meanwhile, decided it was time to throw its hat into the ring too. Then UK Foreign Secretary David Cameron popped up in April 2024 on an extensive tour and declared a new era. Because we haven't heard that phrase in foreign policy about 1 million times. Is any of it going to be a real permanent framework or just another acronym that goes into indefinite hiatus? Well, your guess is as good as mine, but you can bet Central Asia's leaders are sending them all politely worded meeting requests on LinkedIn to see if it'll turn into actual investment dollars. And now, here to shed more light on the issue is Bruce Pannier, a board member at the Caspian Policy Center. Bruce, and welcome to Eastern Express.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So we are slowly approaching the end of the year, and I would like to do a little roundup of the Central Asia region in this edition of Eastern Express. And I'm wondering whether or not it'd be fair to kind of say that the region has been gaining more relevance in the past few years.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's completely fair to say that Central Asia is really putting itself on the map, or has really put itself on the map in 2024. There's a lot of things involved in this, but in fact, because of trade routes, and that's partially in connection with what's happening with the Red Sea and the problems trying to get transit through there, but also part of the problem is trying to avoid Russian territory, moving goods east to west. So Central Asia has really come to the fore all of a sudden. There's this so-called middle corridor that links Europe and China through Central Asia and the Caucasus. And beyond that, Central Asia has kind of pried itself a little bit away from Russia in this year and trying to get less dependent upon China. And they've had all kinds of other countries come in to express their interest in various things that are available or possibly available in Central Asia, critical minerals being one. So you've seen a real rise in the Arab states paying attention to Central Asia. Turkey, of course, has been making inroads in Central Asia for the last couple of years also. But even the European Union's kind of upped its presence in Central Asia. And the United States is trying to make moves, or showing that they're starting to make moves too, to get better ties with the Central Asian government. So if you're in Central Asia, this is probably the most attention you've ever had since becoming independent in 1991.
Right. You mentioned that most countries in Central Asia are distancing themselves from Russia and also trying to stay away from the Chinese influence. But when we look at the map geopolitically, do you think that is something that is viable, seeing that they are essentially sandwiched between the two big nations?
Well, I suppose I should qualify that a little bit. I mean, obviously, Russia and China are always going to play a very big role in Central Asian politics, and certainly in terms of foreign policy. But the fact is, the last couple of years, they were, and really in Russia's case, at the very start since independence, and in China's case since the late 1990s, I mean, they have been the primary partners. There was a period when the West was there, it was related to Afghanistan, but as far as trade and really security, it's been just Russia and China. So it's been interesting in 2024 that although they're still there and they're still the biggest trade partners with the Central Asians, it's less so than it used to be. It's more mixed and a more balanced foreign policy that the Central Asians have compared to just 3 years ago. So will Central Asia be able to totally avoid dealing with Russia or China anytime in the foreseeable future? Absolutely not. That's not going to happen. But it helps them that they do have stronger alliances and stronger friendships already in progress with other countries.
And, well, do you think that the war in Ukraine has much to do with Russia's diminishing influence in the region, or do you think there are other factors at play here?
Certainly that is one, and the most basic explanation for that is the fact that Russia has started to make comments, and Russian officials have made comments that, with the historical Russian land, what is historical Russian land at the time of Peter the Great or the Soviet Union or whatever, but Putin has said that he considers all the territory of the former Soviet Union to be historical Russian land, right? So if you're in Central Asia and you hear that comment and see what's happening in Ukraine, then of course it makes you worried about what Russia's intentions are going forward. So that has certainly hurt Central Asia's relationship with Russia. Now, there's another thing that happened just this year too: the Crocus City Hall terrorist attack. It was blamed on Tajik nationals, and most of whom were migrant laborers. But even the Tajik nationals that weren't migrant laborers were Tajiks who had obtained Russian citizenship, although they were born in Tajikistan. The xenophobia that grew out of that has really painted all the Central Asians with the same brush at this moment. So it doesn't matter if you're Tajik, you probably get the worst end of this. But if you're Uzbek, Kyrgyz, Turkmen, any of the Central Asian groups, you're also getting exposed to this too. The average Russian does not make that much of a distinction between a Tajik and a Kyrgyz. So there's been a huge backlash against the Central Asians. Now, there was a time when there was 8 million citizens of Central Asia that were working in Russia as migrant labor. Those numbers are starting to go down significantly after the Crocus City Hall terrorist attack, because There's new regulations that they're imposing, the prejudice that they're exposed to on the streets of Russia all the time. The attempts at recruitment. They can lock up young men, for instance. You get locked up in jail. You're facing some kind of charges. Maybe they're real, maybe they're trumped up. We don't know. But the solution that the Russians offer is you can join the military and go serve in Ukraine, and we'll wipe the slate clean. And at the end of it, if you survive, you'll become a Russian citizen. So all these things are very unattractive to the Central Asians at the moment, and they're starting to rethink that. A lot of people who used to go to Russia to find work are either looking for work in other countries, or they are staying home and trying to find a job in their own homeland.
Right. What about the European countries? You mentioned earlier that Central Asia is looking to expand its alliance outside of just the big players. How have countries like Germany and France been reaching out to Central Asia?
Well, the first thing I should say is that the EU as a bloc has actually been a major partner of Central Asia for years. The EU is the leading trade partner and source of investment for Kazakhstan. And Kazakhstan has the biggest economy of any of the Central Asian countries. But the EU has been involved with all of the Central Asian nations. Now, we're entering a new era of what people have said critical minerals are the new hydrocarbons of the 21st century. You got to have lithium, beryllium, all these other gallium, antimony, all these products that are necessary for everyday goods now that we're seeing, the technology that runs the world today. And there's a fair amount of those things in Central Asia. So it's not surprising that the German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, was in Central Asia just a couple months ago. That was one of the things that he wanted to talk about when he was in Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan was what are the possibilities for German companies to be involved in surveying for and exploiting, digging up, mining critical minerals in some of the Central Asian countries. And they've been reciprocal in Central Asia, too. I mean, they've advertising themselves as a source of these very important minerals all of a sudden. So it's something of an El Dorado for the Central Asians. And it's not just Germany that's been interested in this. It's other countries in Europe who also have shown up, sent their delegations out there to talk about this. Besides that, there's the more traditional hydrocarbon well. Kazakhstan is still a major supplier of oil to many countries in Europe. They're trying to get gas pipelines that can connect areas in Central Asia. Turkmenistan has the fourth largest reserves of natural gas. They're trying to figure out a way to get Turkmen gas to Europe through Turkey or across the Caspian somehow or one way or another. So there's a lot of ground for partnerships there that to expand the EU Central Asian partnership, both as individual countries within the European Union and Central Asia, and as a bloc, the Central Asian 5 countries with the European Union countries.
All right, and when we look at these sort of connections, it's mostly on a geopolitical administrative level. I'm also wondering, with the whole kind of change of pace when it comes to Central Asia's alliance with Russia, China, as well as the European Union, how are the people, the civilians, adjusting to this kind of new reality, new alliances? Do you think that they have a different perspective looking at the EU, China and Russia now, or do you think that will take some time for them to kind of change their kind of perspective?
This is an interesting aspect to look at. One of the new partnerships, or one of the new pieces of partnerships between European countries, for example, and Central Asia, is that as migrant laborers are shunning, Central Asian migrant laborers are shunning Russia because of all the problems there. There are opportunities opening up in the European Union. I mentioned Chancellor Scholz's visit. Now, one of the other things that they discussed when he was out there was the possibilities of bringing skilled laborers from Central Asia to come and work in Germany. And they already have a program to bring Central Asians to come and work in Germany. A lot of them work in care facilities or transport facilities, those kind of industries. Britain which is not in the European Union, but they've also had programs where they're trying to bring Central Asian migrant laborers over to come and work there. Several other countries have discussed this with the Central Asians. So this is great. Not only do they have a source that's not Russia, but it's actually a better paying source than Russia. I mean, the wages in Russia, depending on what kind of work you were doing, but certainly even in the best case scenarios, were nowhere comparable to what you're going to make if you're actually working in Germany or Austria or some of these other places. So that's probably going to go a long ways to engendering good feelings on the part of Central Asians toward Europe.
Right. And well, we talked a lot about the war in Ukraine being one of the factors and one of the pivotal points when it comes to kind of Central Asia changing their perspective. Now, a lot of talk is around war possibly winding down with the new U.S. administration coming in. We're looking at the potential possibility of the war finally coming to an end. Do you think that that would once again change the perspective of these Central Asian countries and perhaps shift the dynamics again once more?
A lot is going to depend on the terms of the truce or the peace, of course. I think generally for Central Asians, their image of Russia is greatly diminished. When Russia went into the full-scale war of Ukraine, there was people in Moscow that were saying it was going to last 3 days and they would already be in Kiev. Well, it's going to be 3 years pretty soon, and they're nowhere close to being in Kiev. So not only do the Central Asians see that that's happened, that Russia isn't as mighty an army as everyone had thought just a few years ago. But in the meantime, of course, Central Asia has been exposed to some of the fallout from this directly because a lot of what they call relocanti in Central Asia, it's people who are fleeing Russia either to avoid conscription or because the economy is getting worse. And some of them have come and stayed in Central Asia, but more than 1 million certainly have passed through Central Asia on their way to somewhere else, excuse me, because the transport links between Russia and other countries have been cut. You can't fly into a lot of countries. So if you wanted to go to Turkey or to Europe or something and you were a Russian citizen, you'd have to go to another country to find a connection at an airport or something. And a lot of them, like I said, 1 million came through Central Asia just in 2022, and they've still trickled through since then. I mean, it is actually the biggest wave of migration of people through Central Asia in the history of the whole region, and that goes back thousands and thousands of years. But so all the Central Asians have seen this happening. So you can't help but reach the conclusion that Russia is a far weaker country than you were led to believe for all these years. And so even if they manage to get a truce or some kind of peace deal, that will play on the image of Russia for years to come. That actually what they said they were going to be able to do in Ukraine, they could not accomplish. And they were finally forced to come back to the negotiating table and try to figure out a way to get themselves out of that. Past that, the Russian economy is going to be hurting for a long time. The sanctions that many countries have put on Russia for launching that invasion on Ukraine are not going to be lifted because there's a truce or a peace deal. They're still going to be in effect for who knows how long, 5, 10 years or more. So the opportunities for Central Asians to go to Russia and find work, as they used to in the past, are not going to be there like they were in the past. So they're going to be much more limited possibilities to work, actually find employment in Russia. This is something that they're going to have to deal with going forward, and it's going to play on the image of Russia, or how the Central Asians see Russia going forward into the future.
Right, so we'll have to start observing the situation over there and see whether 2025 will bring us a new era. In the meantime, thank you so much for your input and insight. Really appreciate it. And thanks for being with us on the Eastern Express.
Thanks so much for having me. Appreciate it.
And now we're moving on to the Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you don't want to miss. Ukraine will permanently stop transferring Russian gas supply through its territory starting January 1st of 2025. As Kyiv is preparing to make this bold move, the Hungarian Prime Minister said last week that he has a trick to maintain Russian gas transit through Ukraine.
Ukrainian Prime Minister Denis Shmyhal made the announcement during the government question hour in Parliament. The current gas transit agreement between Russia and Ukraine was established in December 2019. It was signed for a 5-year period with the possibility of an extension. Ukraine will, however, continue to transfer Russian oil through its territory under the EU Association Agreement and the Energy Charter Treaty when asked to do so by the European Commission. Meanwhile, Viktor Orban is planning what he calls a trick to maintain the gas transit. He says that if the gas would become the property of its buyers once it enters Ukraine, it would no longer technically be Russian gas. The responses of both Moscow and Kyiv to this proposal remain unknown, although Volodymyr Zelensky has been strongly against any sort of deals with Russia.
The United Nations has revealed the number of civilians killed during the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The official UN report on casualty claimed that over 12,000 civilians have died as a result of the conflict.
The report says that in addition to those who have died, close to 28,000 civilians have also been wounded during the war. The United Nations report comes as Russian President Vladimir Putin has threatened to escalate the war against Ukrainian cities. This escalation would allegedly involve the use of the new Oreshnik missile, which the Russian leader has been boasting about for the last few weeks. According to Moscow, no modern Western anti-air or anti-missile defense system is capable of intercepting it. The UN has found that 42% of the civilian casualties in November were the result of strikes with long-range weapons, such as the Oreshnik. This is a direct increase compared to the previous months, which shows that Russia has been focusing more on targeting civilian infrastructure. Cities such as Kharkiv, Sumy and Odessa have been the main targets.
The Russian Islamic Council has approved polygamy for Muslim males living in Russia. This decision is in direct contradiction with Russian law, which prohibits individuals from entering multiple registered marriages.
According to the latest edict by the Council of Islamic Clerics of Russia, a Muslim male is now allowed to enter up to 4 marriages simultaneously, as long as certain conditions are met. At the same time, Russia's family code forbids a person from entering a registered marriage with someone who is already married. Nevertheless, Russian authorities have been struggling with the country's dire demographic situation, amid a decline that has been exacerbated by emigration, low birth rates, and high mortality rates. These issues have been even further compounded by the death rate in the war in Ukraine. Moscow has been actively looking at various solutions to encourage Russians to have more children to combat the population decline. It is unclear how the Russian government will respond to this decision by the Islamic Council.
And that's all for this episode of Eastern Express. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.